Thank you very much, Erez. This was a great talk. Worrying as well.
Yeah.
It's not just great, but it's you know, when you show the evidence. I mean, we all have this idea that accent bias is there and very strong, no matter how much we try to combat it, you know, to fight it in specific contexts. But it's clearly when you do quantitative research and you actually see that it's something that is quite strong and it's hard to get rid of. It is really worrying, and it actually raises to me a lot of alarms when it comes to not just the workplace but society more generally. So do you want to continue sharing, or do you want to stop sharing?
Yeah, I can stop. I can stop. And then
actually, people could turn on their cameras if they want, and they could raise their hands. I'm looking at the chat. Yeah, I've got excellent comment from the chat. Is there so if somebody wants to ask a question, could you please raise your hand and unmute, or you can type. So while people are thinking of oh yeah, Magda. Okay, Magda, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much. But if you'd like to start off, Yanti,
no, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's been a great talk, and I've been very much interested in that. I'm investigating the topic from a slightly different perspective, more of a accent perception also in learners and native speakers. And recently we've been looking at the perception of Norwegian accents. There is a wide variety of Norwegian accents, and particularly we want to see how learners of Norwegian, if they aligned with more of the stereotypical views of the Norwegian society. Anyway, so my question relates to, I mean, I have several questions, but one of them, for instance, in your first experiment, your first study with accent labels, if I remember correctly, you looked at two parameters. They were rating pleasantness and prestige. Were they lumped together, or they were separate? I'm asking because we had an array of different labels attached to actually audio stimuli, as in your second study. And we thought in the principal component analysis, we saw that exactly these parameters, pleasantness, or we had friendliness dimension, was opposed to prestige dimension. So for instance, Oslo would come up as prestigious, but less friendly, as opposed to northern accents like Tromsø would be just the opposite. So I had an impression that yours were lumped together, maybe, or maybe.
No, they weren't. So I was only showing you the results for prestige. So we did, we treated them separately when people rated them separately. So first they were asked, how prestigious do you think these accents are? And then how pleasant do you think they are? And we found, that they were, that they were sort of inverse of one another. So things that were more prestigious tended to be less pleasant, and vice versa, except for the very top rated accents. So RP, Queen's English, were heard as both prestigious and very pleasant. And this has been discussed in the past as Giles calls it the imposed norm hypothesis, that because it's such an imposition that this is sort of the most statusful accent, that we're conditioned to also think of it as pleasant, even if maybe we don't. But it's just because it's the norm, it must be both. Whereas everything else, we see this separation. So for example, northern accents, as you say, were also in England, I don't know, there's something between the north-south, northern accents were heard as less prestigious but more pleasant, and southern accents the opposite.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I have some further, but I would like to give the floor to other people and then maybe come back.
Other questions? Yes, Eva.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really great talk. And it is not my field at all, but as someone who lives in Manchester and has lived in Austria, it really, rang quite a few bells. I was wondering whether your findings in your study with the lawyers, which I was actually surprised, I mean, pleasantly surprised that there was strong accent bias. But could it be related to the fact that your stimuli were kind of coinized dialect, so general Northern English as opposed to Liverpool English? And to what extent could reactions, I mean, in the extreme case, I think there will be an intelligibility issue between the listeners of some varieties and speakers of other varieties. When you get that, would that affect the rating?
Yeah, no, those are both really excellent points. So in terms of the coinization, I think general Northern English, I think generally across the board listeners weren't quite sure what to do with that, because it is kind of a difficult accent. It just sounds sort of generally Northern, but you can't really pinpoint it to a particular place. But we're also not finding any difference for what we're calling urban West Yorkshire, which is essentially Leeds. So it's very much, it's an urban Leeds accent, and that's so specifically localizable and very, you know, stereotypically working class for the north of England. And that also wasn't showing effect. In the same way that estuary, which is also maybe somewhat more coinized, but, you know, our speakers of estuary were more on the sort of Cockney end of estuary, so it really sounds like a sort of East End of London kind of Cockney accent. And also there, among the lawyers at least, we're not finding the bias pattern. And I mean, and this is going back to what Ianti said before, I think this is, yeah, generally we have a lot of bad news in our findings, but we actually take a lot of heart from the lawyer response, because I think it really shows that if you create the right kind of context and if you encourage the right kinds of norms, then people can overcome bias. And it's about finding the ways in which to make that more widespread, that people think about bias as a problem, and so then they don't let it influence their reactions. In terms of intelligibility, yes, it's an excellent point. I can just say two things briefly. So we did collect information about people's familiarity and exposure to all of the accents, and that didn't change. So when all that's included in the model or not, it doesn't change the effects that we have. So clearly, yes, people respond slightly differently to accents they're more familiar with, or accents they've been exposed to, say in childhood, for example, but it doesn't change the overall patterns that we're finding. That said, it's for a long time now, I've been wanting to run an experiment that tests that slightly more in a more robust fashion. So specifically, I'd like to do a pupillometry study just to see if there is any sort of processing difficulty that happens when you encounter, say, multicultural London English, which is the newest accent and one that people are perhaps least familiar with. And I, you know, hopefully, if I can, get rid of any processing effects, then show that it's really just a social bias effect, or it might be, you know, an actual processing effect that's you know, interacting with social bias in some kind of complicated way. So yeah, we had a whole plan for a pupillometry study that was all set up and ready to go, and then COVID happened, so then we couldn't do it. But hopefully we'll get back to it at some point.
Yes, I hope you will be able to. Yes. So, Monica, you're next.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask, well, I'm doing my research on accent bias in Slovak. And, I wanted to ask, you said that raising awareness is the most effective in fighting accent bias. Have you published any article that would claim that? Or is it in any, because I didn't see the reference on the slide.
Yeah, no, it hasn't been published yet. So we talk about it in a, I mean, it's been published in we wrote a report for the Social Mobility Commission in the UK, and we talk about it there, but we haven't submitted that experiment yet for publication. But the experiment's all done and it's there, and there's, you know, all the statistics back up what I'm saying, but it just hasn't come out yet. But I'm happy to send you more details of the experiment if that would be helpful, like information about the protocols and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's great that you're doing this in Slovak. That's wonderful.
No, there are no accent bias studies in, like, what we call second world, you know, all these in the first world, so none of them are done in post-communist countries that have really prescriptive, policies and like this cult of standard language, which is very different from, let's say English-speaking world. So I think it might, well, I'm still running my experiment, so we'll see.
Yeah, there is a tiny bit of work. It's not specific to an employment context, but there's work on attitudes and stereotypes in Georgia, which is interesting and potentially relevant. So, but that's the issue, is that you do have like snippets of attitudes work, but I guess I'm pushing, what I'm hoping to sort of advocate for is going beyond simply attitudes, but looking at attitudes in these particular kinds of contexts that have social ramifications.
The thing is, like in languages that are not big as English or German, like for example in Slovak, there is no publication about like the description of accents. Like there are like sentences about like any phonetic properties or anything about accents. So like we don't even really know how many accents do we have. Like it's just my like knowledge as a native speaker, but it's not published. So I had to go like much further to start. The starting line is like pushed. So that's also like a problem.
That's definitely the case.
All languages.
Yeah.
Thank you, Monica. Chiara.
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. Hello. First of all, thank you for your brilliant presentation. It was really interesting to me because my research topic, I'm doing my PhD in Italy, and my research topic is really close to this. I actually had occasion to study some of the material you mentioned, and especially I started from the studies done on accents in the UK. But now I'm focusing on accent prejudice towards those who speak English as non-native speakers. And I was wondering, because your focus was on job interviews and the employment sector, which is really interesting and I think has maybe the most impact on people's daily lives. But I was thinking that could it be that those who are involved in the examination process have a higher demand to focus on the content more than the accent? So it could be kind of a different situation compared to those who are, like, for example, in a customer position. So, for example, they are quicker to judge people according to their accent before they can even access the knowledge on the topic.
Yeah.
And so is there a way to kind of go beyond that, do you think? Because I'm not dealing with employment, I'm dealing with education mostly, and the academic context. So I would, even if, for example, people who are giving lectures, they have, of course, an expertise in a certain sectors, people still judge them negatively because maybe the foreign accent is really strong, and this kind of impedes proper communication, at least in their opinion. So do you think there is a way to kind of navigate this?
Navigate it and study it. I think definitely it's important to be looking at these other social situations. So in the US and in the UK, there's not a huge amount, but there is work on these kinds of biases emerging in, say, housing. So people are, calling up to try and visit an apartment, be able to rent an apartment, where it's been shown that they're getting accent bias there. In customer service encounters, definitely. There are a few studies, particularly within behavioral economics. It's the people who are doing that kind of quantitative economic work, looking at these customer service encounters, and a couple of them have looked at accent and found that, with, call centers and things like that, people get treated differently depending on the kinds of accent that they have. And then also medicine is one. So medical communication is an area where this is starting to become increasingly prevalent. There's more and more work on this. So particularly in the UK, I know of 2 studies looking both at how medical students are evaluated in their final exams, so the oral portions of their final exams, and the ways in which accents, and they're focusing on native, non-native, might have an effect, and then also how non-native English-speaking doctors are evaluated by patients in different kinds of medical encounters. So I definitely think there's a huge amount of scope to be looking at this in a variety of different contexts. And when we first, started working on this project, we were thinking about, universities, we were, interviews for acceptance into a university, we were thinking about medicine, and we ended up settling on law because it's the field that had the longest tradition of these kinds of issues being studied in the UK. But I don't think that there's any reason why it shouldn't be also looked at in all these other places, because it's certainly something that is affecting people's lives, and there's certainly ways in which you can figure out how to devise studies to investigate it. Yeah, so I think it's great that you're doing it.
Thank you. And if I kind of follow-up question, are you planning on continuing your research as you're doing on employment, but including also foreign accents?
Yeah, it's a question that we're asked a lot. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be something that we would be interested in doing. We would just need to think about, do we also expand it in other ways? We're thinking about the different kinds of expansions that one could have, and we're basically trying to decide whether we want to expand into outside of British accents, or if we want to expand to a different sector. So we were thinking about looking at medicine. And I think we just need to decide whether we do sector or both foreign and British. Yeah.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask something quickly, and then I'll give the floor to Magda for her follow-up, if that's okay. So I had several questions. I think this is really excellent research. I was just wondering, in terms of the factors you presented. So the first one was age. Which actually showed the difference. And then it was a question of whether it was quality, so the content, as opposed to, a general. So I wonder to what extent these two factors play a role, because there is something that happens at the cognitive level, or is it something that is more at the behavioral level that... So when you get older, you decide you are entitled to sort of be more biased way. But then, the other factor has to do with, if you are evaluating content, subconsciously, you stop looking at form and you're looking more at meaning. So, how do these two factors pan out? I mean, I'm just...
Yeah. I mean, I guess that what we would want, the goal is that you have people actually paying attention to content and not to form, right? I mean, that's in terms of the sort of cues that we want people listening to. And if your goal is to assess expertise, assess suitability for employment, then we would hope that you would focus on this very specific cue of competence, which should be the content of speech. But that's clearly not always happening. And sometimes you get these more what are described as diffuse cues of social group membership that are interfering there. In terms of how that interacts with age, I mean, I see what you're saying. I mean, I do think it's a question of a sort of license to discriminate, I suppose, or license to focus on those kinds of more diffuse cues as one gets older. But then it's interesting that this interacts with things like region. So why is it that we're finding this most prominently amongst older listeners in the south, right, of England, as opposed to in the north? So yes, I think that across the board, and you even saw in that first slide where I showed the age effect, as we get older, we all become more judgmental. I think that just happens, right? We all rate things more negatively, and that's a fairly consistent finding in a lot of the attitudes literature. So what actually is more interesting is that even though everybody's becoming more judgmental, we're also getting this accent bias effect emerging for listeners in the South. So that's really the key.
Okay, so just one other thing, which is completely irrelevant, but completely relevant to my other questions. But I was wondering, if you were to run a study like this in India, which is highly linguistically diverse, and people are multilingual themselves, and they are open to code switching, and there is no such clear boundary between, a variety in the language, and there are all sorts of social linguistic issues associated with this, of course. Do you think you will find similar results?
It's an interesting question. I mean, obviously, I don't necessarily know, but I'm tempted to say no. I think that a big part of what we're finding is sort of, particularly for the first study, I think it's very clear for labels. Basically, what we're getting sort of materialization of language ideologies as they exist in the UK. And the UK, as you know, has a very sort of rigid sort of system of language attitudes. I would anticipate that in places that have a different one, maybe a less rigid one or a more variable one, that we wouldn't find these kinds of distinctions. And that's a long-standing claim that even, say, you know, in the English-speaking world, it's been made between, say, the UK and the US, that the US is somewhat less sharp in these kinds of attitudes. And so I can imagine that in India, then maybe we wouldn't find any, but I certainly don't know enough about the Indian context to speak to that. But you make a good point. I mean, that the majority of the work on these kinds of questions has been done in places that have very strong standard language ideologies. So the UK, the German-speaking world, France, there's a lot of discussions on them. It would be interesting, incredibly interesting, to look at this in places where those standard languages don't hold the same kind of force, or there are potential multiple competing standards, like in the Norwegian case. I mean, that's why it can be interesting to look at these kinds of places where you are in a more dynamic and fluid kind of linguistic landscape. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Magda, do you want to come back with your other question?
If I may, just very brief one. I mean, I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to answer their questions too. I was just interested in your second experiment that you reported on, when the accent bias was investigated via the audio samples. Actually, they listened to. Interestingly, your design was very similar to ours in the sense that you had 2 representatives per 5 selected regions, right? If I remember correctly. So my question would be about the interspeaker variability. If you've among these 2 selected speakers, have you found any major differences? And how do you think that the ratings were affected by the voice quality themselves? Have you looked into that more deeply?
Yes, so we have, I mean, voice quality is an interesting point. I actually have a slide that I can show you. I can do one of these bonus slide things. Where is it? There. So here's the variability. This is from this second experiment, so the voices experiment across the 10 different speakers. You see that, yeah, there is. I mean, so certainly look at, say, MLE, it's quite dramatic. This is, this is the accent that overall is rated the lowest. But you see that one of the speakers is actually very highly rated, on par with RP, whereas the other one is clearly the lowest, right? And when we look at what it is that is happening here, it's really a difference in accent density, by which I mean the number of distinctive features that these speakers have. So voice quality, we didn't pay too much attention to. We did control, so we normalized. We normalized for pitch, we normalized for speech rate, we normalized for intensity and things like that. So those were not different across all 10 of the speakers. We didn't do other prosodic factors. So really what this appears to be, this difference in MLE, is a difference in the specific features that are being used. And I can show you what they are. Like, so for example, the MLE speaker who has what we're calling a stronger accent has, if you just count them, 48 distinctive features, whereas the milder MLE speaker has only 19. And that seems to correlate with the ratings that they get. What's interesting, though, is that we also, among the speakers of a northern variety, one of the stronger accented speakers has 42. The milder accented one has 14. So a similar difference of 28 or 29 between the 2 of them. But when we actually look at ratings, we see that for the MLE speaker, having a strong accent leads to being significantly downgraded in judgments, whereas for the northern speaker, it does not, right? So there is an objective linguistic difference between them that's comparable, but the results go beyond that objective linguistic difference. So in short, having a strong accent is more detrimental if you speak MLE, if you speak already a stigmatized variety, than it is if you speak a variety that's less stigmatized. So it's sort of an interaction between actual linguistic content and broader ideologies, again, attitudes and ideologies. Yeah, and this is all this work on dialect density and these differences that we're finding. We've just submitted for publication, so it should hopefully be coming out soon.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? No? Well, I think we've grilled you enough, Erez. It's been going on for some time now, the question period. So on behalf of everyone here and the executive committee of the SLE, I would like to thank you very much for the amazing talk.
Thank you.
We are glad we recorded it so other people will have access to it. Yeah, congratulations and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thank you. Thanks.